To blur or not to blur? With companies announcing blazing fast T1.0 lenses, some image makers are increasingly adamant on voicing their resistance to shallow depth of field. But not all blur is created equal. Bokeh is not the only kind of blur, and it's worth discussing some of the different applications. Sometimes the frames recorded are less like the movie you envisioned, and softening would make them look more cinematic. Adding blur in post with DaVinci Resolve 19 can be an appropriate balancing trick. Mid-detail is one method of taking the edge off, though lowering this affects detail as well as sharpness. This also doubles up as a skin smoothing tool in case your subject has poor complexion or too many wrinkles. The key to implementing any of these methods is subtlety. If you opt for a tasteful approach, you should try to make it nearly imperceptible. I wouldn't go less than -30 unless I wanted a hazy effect. Bloom works pretty well in combination with this feature. Tilt shift blur is a stylish look that adds dramatic blur to the edges of the frame. You can control whether it is on the sides or top and bottom, leaving the middle perfectly sharp. I enjoy horizontal implementation, which has a unique feeling, especially in 2.39 aspect ratio. It can evoke a nostalgic, dreamy feeling, and I think pairs well with vignette. It can also create the perception of heat, imitating the appearance of a heat mirage you might see on the horizon of a distant highway during a hot summer's day. For these kinds of blur, you can consider lowering the strength and presence if you find it too distracting. Most blurs can feel artificial when overdone, so you can also consider adding flicker, grain, or any of the other effects I mentioned to dither its appearance. I think tilt shift in particular will complement deep focus drone footage. Radial blur is an exciting tool that can look stylish or realistic. It mimics the swirly bokeh you might see on a Petzval or Helios, but you'll have to adjust its strength and position. The coolest utility is that you can get a somewhat anamorphic vibe if you letterbox, because radial blur is perpendicular to your selected point, which can resemble waterfall bokeh on the sides. This effect is quite overpowering, and I would suggest not going over 0.3 strength, because the blur aggressively softens the entire frame including the center. If you do select a stronger look, be aware it won't be able to follow your subject moving across the frame because the focal point is stationary. Alternatively, you can reduce its strength to fine levels to gently soften up the entire frame, making your images a little less digital feeling. I think tripod footage is best suited with this application. The final blur I'm covering is radius blur, which also functions as a reverse sharpening tool. You really want to be delicate with this, going no higher than 0.53. However, the way I implement it is to apply the blur in a layer mixer node underneath the primary grade to provide a subtler look. I also implement this technique in most of my LUTs, so if you like the look from my videos, you can support me by purchasing some of my filmmaking assets through my website or Patreon. This really takes the edge off the sharpness, and I recommend doing this if you consider your lenses to be overly clinical. You can experiment with even wilder blurs like zoom, prism, and motion blur to create hallucinogenic effects, but those don't personally interest me as much. Be warned that when uploading darker content with artificial blur online, banding is exacerbated due to YouTube compression. Although filmmakers often ideally want more of the scene in focus, there are many reasons to shoot wide open. Even if your sensibilities disagree, there's an undeniable primal attraction to the beloved blurry background. For one, it allows focus tracking, which is one of my favorite modern filmmaking techniques. Two, it allows you to isolate your subject and obliterate the background, which is essentially practical VFX to remove ugly objects from your scene. For narrative work, this shouldn't be a crutch, because the scene should be in total control, and you might end up obscuring all your hard work in location scouting and costume design. But when traveling, there's not always time to compose a shot, and bokeh can make a background appear less mundane. It also makes it easier to clearly see what's in focus during the day when sunlight glares on the camera monitor. For certain styles like handheld, missing focus can sometimes add a pleasing artistic flair, particularly with Zeiss lenses due to their smoother out-of-focus transition. Bokeh also makes handheld work comparatively less nauseating, as less of the shaky frame is in focus. If you care about sharpness, Motion blur also gives the impression of a softer image, meaning you can employ handheld or tripod shots to your advantage. Just like the exposure triangle, there's a push and pull relationship between aperture, blur, and sharpness. If you're someone that thinks modern camera equipment looks too sharp and digital, stopping down with a lens actually might have an undesirable result. All lenses are typically softer wide open, including modern Zeiss, which also have a secondary rendering at low f-stops. I'm shooting on Blackmagic and the Zeiss Milvis, which is the sharpest combination at my disposal. But with my Sigma FP, its softer sensor is arguably more compatible with sharper optics. Everyone's gear is different, which is why I find blanket statements like Bokeh Bad to be low-resolution thinking. Even if stopping down is overall more cinematic in a legacy sense, there are plenty of artistic situations where blur can improve your visuals. I often shoot deep focus around f8 for narrative work, which is why I typically implement some kind of supplementary blur in my grading. Sharpness seems to be the hurdle a lot of image quality enthusiasts struggle with. The purpose of this video is to demonstrate that there are ways to get your desired visuals without spending extra money. Your equipment isn't always holding you back, as I'm sure we've all seen baffling good smartphone footage once graded properly. There's no need to obsess over gear when adjusting blur, contrast, and highlight roll-off in the color grade can also assist with that gentle sharpness. Anyone can attain this skill. It's just a matter of experience and taste. If a colorblind person like me can learn it, you can too. Your equipment will only ever be as useful as your understanding of it. Make your images bend to your will. Your gear means nothing. Your cleverness is everything.